The women move as one, the shuffle of wooden clogs against frozen mud merging with the wind. You can hear their breath, not as sound, but as rhythm. It's the heartbeat of survival, shallow, steady, hidden. The morning arrives without color. Only the faintest light filters through the mist, a thin gray that does not so much rise as it seeps, slow and reluctant, into the cold. You're standing in Ravensbrück. Not the Ravensbrück of maps or archives, but the one that still breathes somewhere in the soil. The air tastes of iron and ash, of damp wool and breath held too long. If these quiet journeys through the past speak to you, take a moment to subscribe, not out of habit, but to keep their stories alive. And before we drift deeper, tell us where you're listening from, or which image lingers with you the most. Now, breathe in. Let the present fade. The wire hums softly, like a string pulled tight across time. And through it, you can almost hear the voices again, low, steady, human. You're listening to echoes of war. Frost clings to the wire, delicate as lace, cruel as memory. Beyond it, the forest waits, silent, patient, pretending not to see. Inside, rows of women stand in the yard, their bodies outlined in mist. They are wrapped in uniforms that once had color, now drained to the same hue as the fog. No one speaks. The sound of boots far off is enough to make silence the only safe thing. A guard clears her throat. A whistle breaks the air, short, sharp, final. You pass through them like smoke, between faces that look both young and ancient. A teacher from Krakow, a nurse from Lyon, a seamstress from Oslo, a woman who once sang on a stage in Prague, a mother who no longer remembers the weight of her child. They stand shoulder to shoulder, yet each alone inside her own storm. Somewhere in the barracks, a door bangs. Steam rises from a tin bucket, the morning ration of water already freezing around the edges. Hands move quickly, passing the bucket down a line, each woman taking a sip like a prayer. One drop too long, and the next will have less. It is the arithmetic of captivity. Smoke drifts from the chimney of the kitchen block. The smell is not of food, but of something burned beyond naming. The dogs bark. The roll call begins. Names are shouted and swallowed by wind. Numbers replace them, easier to remember, easier to forget. You watch the scene unfold not as an intruder, but as witness, the kind who arrives too late to help, but too soon to look away. History moves slowly here, thick as syrup, congealed by fear. Every sound is a measurement of power. The click of heels, the jangle of keys, the low hum of women counting days in silence. There are over 100,000 who will pass through these gates before it's done. Women from every corner of occupied Europe. Political prisoners, resistance couriers, Jehovah's Witnesses, doctors, mothers, spies. Each assigned to labor until the body forgets its own shape. Each learning the same vocabulary. Hunger, obedience, endurance. The camp was built to contain, but it could not contain the truth of what it created. Even now, when the frost cracks and the birds refuse to sing, something of their strength lingers. It moves through the air like a pulse, faint but unbroken. You notice it in small things, the hand that steadies another's shoulder, the whisper of a forbidden song, the way a thread of light finds its way through barbed wire. These are the details history often forgets, but memory refuses to release. The guards walk the perimeter with rifles resting in their arms. Some avert their eyes, others do not. Above them, a tower watches everything, indifferent as the sky. The lake nearby lies frozen, its surface smooth as glass. Beneath it, reeds curl and sleep, waiting for spring that will take years to arrive. Inside the camp, time folds in on itself. Morning, noon, evening, all blur into one long winter. And still, the women stand. Some will survive. Many will not. But for now, in this narrow space between darkness and daylight, they remain, breathing, waiting, enduring. Chapter 1. Blueprints of Control. The idea of order. Before the camp existed, there was only water and forest. A still lake called Schwetzsee, framed by birch and pine. In summer, the air shimmered with dragonflies. In winter, the ice formed perfect, glassy sheets that could hold a child's reflection. It was the kind of place where the world seemed incapable of cruelty. Then came the lines on paper. Measured, exact, indifferent. An architect's pencil scratching over blueprints in an office hundreds of kilometers away. Each stroke transforming quiet landscape into geometry. Barracks, towers, walls, wire. It began as all systems of control begin, with a sketch, a table, and a man convinced that order could perfect the world. Heinrich Himmler imagined Ravensbrück not as chaos, but as precision. A camp designed exclusively for women, built near the town of Fürstenberg, far from the front, close enough to Berlin for oversight, far enough for secrecy. It would serve as a re-education center, a place where disobedient women could be corrected through work. The words were chosen carefully, clean, bureaucratic, almost gentle. They disguised the truth the way a wall hides a grave. Construction began in November 1938. The first workers were prisoners from Sachsenhausen, men who would build the foundation of the place that would later cage their wives, their sisters, their daughters. They cut down trees, poured concrete, hammered stone. The cold bit into their hands, but the blueprints did not care. Himmler visited the site twice. He looked out over the lake and saw not beauty, but potential. He spoke of efficiency, of supervision, of loyalty. He spoke of obedience as architecture, and Ravensbrück would be his model. By spring 1939, the fences rose, the watchtowers gleamed, and the gates were ready to close. Stone and silence. Every wall begins with silence, and Ravensbrück was built from it. The silence of men who followed orders. The silence of townspeople who saw the barbed wire go up and asked no questions. The silence of a world already holding its breath, waiting for war. The camp's design was simple, efficient, like a diagram of submission. At its heart stood the Appellplatz, the roll call square, where hundreds would stand motionless for hours, snow melting on their shoulders, dust rising around their ankles. To the north, the barracks stretched in perfect symmetry, rows of wooden rectangles, each containing tiers of bunks and the smell of fear. To the south, kitchens, workshops, punishment blocks. And beyond them, the crematorium, a small building with a tall, polite chimney that smoked only when the wind allowed. The architecture itself became a kind of ideology. Every angle, every corridor, every tower was designed to remind those inside that they were being watched, not only by guards, but by the geometry of the place. Even the light obeyed. It fell in sharp divisions, bright on one side of the yard, shadow on the other. To cross from one to the other was to step between two worlds. The town nearby continued with its life. Trains, bakeries, postmen, market days. From certain hills, one could see the fence glinting in the sun like a second horizon. But few looked too long. It was easier to believe the stories, that it was a labor camp, a correctional facility, a place for difficult women. Easier not to imagine the cries that sometimes drifted across the water at night. In the camp's first months, dogs patrolled the perimeter, their shadows moving faster than the guards themselves. Inside, the barracks filled slowly. Beds, uniforms, tools, all arranged with the same cold efficiency as the blueprint. The system was ready. It only needed people. The first women arrive. May 1939. The gates opened to the first transport, 867 women from Lichtenberg, an older prison being emptied for something new. They stepped off the trucks and into the smell of fresh paint and wet earth. Some carried small bags, most carried nothing. The guards stood at attention, rifles gleaming, boots polished to mirrors. The commandant, a woman named Johanna Langfeld, watched in silence. At first, most of the prisoners were German, political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, asocials, and those who had refused the new order. They were told they were here to learn discipline through labor. They would sew, clean, and build, for the Reich, for redemption, for as long as it took. But the lessons taught in Ravensbrück were not about redemption. They were about endurance. Each woman was stripped, shaved, disinfected, and issued a number. Her clothes were replaced by coarse grey fabric, her name erased by the click of a typewriter. A triangle of colored cloth on her chest would now define her, red for political, purple for religious, black for asocial. The hierarchy was as precise as the architecture. Every morning began with a whistle, shrill, slicing the dark like a blade. Women lined up on the Appellplatz, their breath forming clouds that hung over the yard. Those who faltered were punished, not for what they had done, but for breaking the pattern. Work followed, quarry, construction, factory. Every movement measured, every mistake recorded. It was not the labor itself that broke them. It was the repetition. By winter 1940, the camp held nearly 3,000 women. They came from all across occupied Europe, Poles, Czechs, Dutch, Norwegians. The languages blended into a strange silence, too many accents to understand, too much fear to speak. They communicated through eyes, gestures, fragments of song. Even in captivity, they found rhythm, the small defiance of surviving another day. The system breathes. Systems learn to run themselves. At Ravensbrück, that lesson came quickly. The guards gave orders, the coppos enforced them, the prisoners obeyed, and soon the machine required almost no words. It was efficiency at its purest form, cruelty automated through habit. The camp became its own organism. It breathed in transports and exhaled corpses. It pulsed with roll calls, work details, punishments. The soundscape of the place settled into something disturbingly familiar. Boots, dogs, clogs, the faint hum of sewing machines in the workshops. And beneath it all, the quiet breathing of thousands of women learning how to disappear without dying. At night, the barracks smelled of damp straw and soap. Some women prayed in whispers. Others stared at the ceiling and counted cracks. Some still dreamed of home. Others no longer dared. The stars above the camp looked the same as they did over Paris, Warsaw, Oslo, but here they meant something else. Unreachable, indifferent, free. From the towers, guards watched the rows of huts glowing faintly under weak bulbs. They smoked cigarettes and listened to the wind drag across the wire. For them it was a posting, not home, not war, just duty. Some felt pity. Some felt nothing at all. In the morning, the cycle began again, precise as clockwork, merciless as weather. Work, count, work, count. The camp was alive, but not with life, with control. It had become what the blueprints always promised, a world where obedience was architecture and silence was law. And through it all, the women remained. They carried the weight of the system on their backs, and somehow, in the smallest gestures, they defied it. A hidden crust of bread, a shared glance, a whisper of a song from home. each act a blueprint of another kind, the architecture of endurance. Chapter 2. The Language of Labor. Work as Doctrine. Before the first machine ever arrived, work already had a language here. It was the gospel of the Reich, the creed that turned punishment into purpose. Arbeit mocked free, they said elsewhere, but in Ravensbrück, work didn't pretend to make anyone free. It was the translation of control into motion. Every order carried the same refrain: work will make you better. Work will make you obedient. Work will make you silent. The sentences changed, but the meaning didn't. In the logic of the camp, to be still was to be useless, and to be useless was to disappear. The women learned the grammar quickly. Hands replaced words. A gesture from a guard meant lift, carry, scrub. A whistle meant stop. A shouted name meant punishment. Even fatigue had a syntax: the slump of shoulders, the tremor of fingers, the faintest hesitation that could mean a blow. Work began before dawn. Women lined up, heads bowed, wooden clogs sinking into the mud. The guards counted them as one might count inventory, precisely, indifferently. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and frost. Then came the movement, out of the barracks, into the workshops, the fields, the quarry. Hours stretched into eternity. When one ended, another began. Time was measured not in minutes, but in blisters. Those who faltered were sent to the strafblock, the punishment block, where labor became deliberate torture, carrying stones from one pile to another, only to carry them back again. Digging holes, then filling them. Tasks without meaning, but full of intent. The lesson was not in the work itself, but in the submission it demanded. By late 1940, the system was refining itself. The SS discovered that punishment could be profitable, and soon, work would no longer be a moral experiment. It would become an economy. The factories within. In 1942, the gates opened for Siemens. Trucks arrived carrying machines, wires, metal parts, and men in suits. They walked through the camp with notebooks and blueprints, studying the terrain the way one studies an investment. The lake shimmered nearby. The sound of hammers echoed from the distance. Inside the barbed wire, a new industry was being born. The Siemens workshops rose beside the barracks, long, narrow buildings filled with benches, lamps, and drills. Soon, over 2,000 women would be assigned to them, building electrical components for airplanes, submarines, and weapons. The irony was bitter. The same hands that had once sewn dresses, written letters, held children, now assembled tools of destruction. The shift began early. The smell inside the workshops was different from the barracks. Oil, metal, ozone. Machines hummed endlessly. The women worked bent over, eyes straining under weak light. Every motion was monitored by 4 women, some SS, some prisoners themselves. Silence was mandatory, precision expected. Mistakes could mean a beating, a transfer, or worse. Outside, Ravensbrück still functioned as a camp. Inside the workshops, it became a factory. Guards transformed into supervisors. Whips turned into schedules. The cruelty evolved, less visible, more systematic. Production reports were filed, quotas recorded, contracts signed. On paper, Siemens profited. In flesh, the women paid. The rhythm of the machines became part of the soundscape of the camp, a low, constant drone beneath the daily roll calls. To those outside the fences, it might have sounded like progress. To those inside, it was the voice of captivity itself. Some prisoners preferred the factory to the quarry. The work was indoors, the guards less violent, the chance of survival higher. But the cost was slower, more insidious. Days blurred. Voices faded. The mind learned to detach, to move hands without memory. At night, when the machines fell silent, their echo remained. The women would close their eyes and still hear the whirring, a phantom rhythm in their bones. The women of the machines. There was a hierarchy even in suffering. Those assigned to Siemens were often envied by others. They were less exposed to the weather, more likely to receive scraps of extra food. But they also bore a different kind of weight, the guilt of surviving by serving the system. One woman, a teacher from Warsaw, later wrote that she would count the screws she made each day, not to track productivity, but to remind herself that her hands still obeyed her. She whispered the alphabet under her breath, as if each letter was a protest. Another woman carved a small cross from a piece of wire and hid it inside her sleeve. Tiny acts of defiance threaded between gears and bolts. The older prisoners taught the new arrivals how to survive. Never make eye contact with the overseer. Never work too fast. It raises quotas. Never stop moving. Never show pain. These unwritten rules passed from mouth to mouth, like psalms in a language older than fear. Sometimes a song would rise, soft, almost imperceptible, from the far end of the workshop. It wasn't permitted, but it wasn't always punished. The melody drifted between machines like smoke, fragile but persistent. It carried names, places, and the faint memory of warmth. Even here, even in the heart of the machine, humanity found a way to hum. The guards rarely intervened. They were tired too. The work exhausted everyone, body, will, conscience. In this exhaustion, the system thrived, because fatigue is obedience's most loyal friend. The meaning of work. By 1943, Ravensbrück had become a hive of labor, not just Siemens, but tailoring, leatherwork, armaments, even experimental workshops where women were tested for efficiency. The camp had learned to consume its captives entirely, mind, body, time. Some believed the work might save them. Those who produced were less likely to be sent to the transport, the word that meant death without saying it. So they worked harder, faster, quieter. They found meaning in motion, because motion was safer than stillness. Others stopped believing entirely. They moved through the days like shadows, their hands doing what the mind refused to register. The repetition dulled fear, numbed grief. But in that numbness, a strange clarity emerged. If everything could be taken, names, bodies, futures, then what remained was the choice not to surrender the self. Work, in its cruelty, became an accidental teacher. A woman from France later described the moment she realized that survival itself was an act of rebellion. They wanted us to be machines. But every time I thought of my mother's face while turning a screw, I was human again. That was the paradox of Ravensbrück. The system used labor to erase individuality, and yet, through the very rhythm of labor, individuality refused to vanish. The body remembered warmth. The hands remembered creation. The heart remembered song. When night came, the women filed back through the gates, passing under the same words they had seen that morning. The stars hung over the lake, reflected faintly in the water, countless points of light trembling but unbroken. And beneath them, the women moved like a tide of ghosts, carrying both exhaustion and a secret kind of victory. Because even here, within the language of labor, they had learned to speak another dialect, one made of glances, endurance, and the silent refusal to forget. Chapter 3. Experiments in Obedience. The logic of pain. Every system eventually hungers for proof. Ravensbrück was no exception. It had measured obedience through labor, control through silence, but now it sought to measure endurance through pain. The doctors arrived in 1942, wearing white coats and polished boots. Their names were long, their signatures confident. They spoke the language of science, but their laboratory was a prison. They called it research, but what they studied was suffering itself. The orders came from Berlin. The SS Medical Division, under Himmler's authority, authorized a series of clinical trials on women prisoners to test treatments for battlefield wounds and infections. The justification sounded noble on paper, to save German soldiers. But the laboratory was Ravensbrück, and the subjects were Polish women, young, healthy, intelligent, and expendable. They called them the Kaninchen, the rabbits. 74 in total. Their selection was deliberate. Educated women, members of the Polish underground, captured couriers, students, nurses. Their intellect made them dangerous. Their bodies would be made examples. The experiments aimed to simulate war injuries, fractures, infections, muscle grafts. Sulfonamide drugs were tested by first creating wounds, deep, deliberate, contaminated with bacteria or soil. The doctors recorded the results with detached curiosity. Fever, swelling, necrosis. Some died. Others lived to limp for the rest of their lives. The data filled notebooks, but the silence filled the camp. The prisoners who survived remembered the doctors' voices. Calm, academic, precise. No hatred, only method. That was the horror, the absence of emotion. Because evil delivered as procedure leaves no echo, only documentation. The room of needles. The operating theater was small, bright, sterile, windowless. Light reflected from metal trays, instruments lined like an orchestra of control. The smell of disinfectant hung thick in the air, layered over something sweeter, metallic, blood. Women were carried in on stretchers, sometimes conscious, sometimes not. Some were told they were being treated. Others knew. They looked at each other with eyes that had already learned to speak without words. The first incision was always quiet. A slice through skin, a pause, then the voice of the surgeon dictating notes to an assistant. Tissue removed, muscle cut, bone scraped, bacteria applied. Sometimes the wounds were sewn up with shards of glass still inside, to study infection. Sometimes they were left open, dressed and reopened days later. All of it observed, catalogued, analyzed. In the evenings, the doctors dined with officers in the commandant's house. They laughed, toasted, discussed results. The war, they said, demanded sacrifice. They never mentioned whose. The women who were operated on were returned to the barracks, bandaged, feverish, trembling. Their bunks became hospital beds without medicine. Those who could move tended to those who could not. They changed dressings with stolen rags, boiled water over hidden stoves, whispered prayers in Polish, French, or silence. Every gesture of care was a rebellion. One of the rabbits, a woman named Wanda, later described how they would count the footsteps outside, to know when to hide their makeshift bandages, when to pretend to sleep. She said that at night, the smell of infection filled the room so thickly it felt like fog. But even through fever and pain, they whispered stories, of Krakow, of families, of flowers that bloom in spring. It was their anesthesia. It didn't stop the pain, but it gave it shape. The body remembers. By 1943, the experiments expanded. Some were for bone transplants, others for sterilization, others for testing chemical burns. Each carried the same language: efficiency, necessity, progress. But inside the barracks, a counter-language was forming. The rabbits began to resist. They refused to volunteer, hid their wounds, forged numbers on lists, and shared stolen medicine from the infirmary. A secret network of solidarity grew: Polish, Czech, French, Russian, all connected by the will to protect one another. One nurse, herself a prisoner, smuggled morphine when she could. Others risked punishment by cleaning wounds with boiling water at night, using spoons and wire sterilized over candle flames. Every act of healing was a form of sabotage, each recovered woman a failure for the experimenters. The SS doctors began to notice the resistance. They tightened control. Surveillance increased. But the human spirit had already adapted, building its own immune system against despair. There were moments, brief, fragile, when laughter returned, a joke whispered during roll call, a mocking nickname for a doctor, passed quietly down the line. Even in the heart of cruelty, they found ways to remain human. And then came the night when the SS announced new executions. The rabbits were to be eliminated, for security reasons. Word spread through the camp like wind through dry grass. Women hid them under bunks, disguised them as sick, changed their numbers. Others volunteered to take their place. That night, obedience fractured. The system that lived on silence met the sound of solidarity. Some of the rabbits were caught. Many survived because of that underground network, and the chaos of a war now turning against its makers. When liberation came in 1945, only 63 of the original 74 rabbits were alive. They limped, they scarred, they testified, and the world would learn what the word experiment really meant. The experiment's shadow. After the war, the photographs emerged, the notes, the diagrams, the signatures written in confident black ink. They became evidence in Nuremberg, proof of science turned against the soul. But evidence is not the same as memory. Memory breathes differently. It speaks in whispers, in scars, in the way a woman limps decades later across a quiet street. Some of the rabbits testified publicly, their voices steady but soft. They spoke not of vengeance, but of witnessing. They told of the sound of scalpels, the feel of cold metal on skin, the way the ceiling lights blurred through tears. They described how, in the midst of horror, friendship became a form of anesthesia stronger than morphine. Others never spoke at all. Their silence was not absence but continuation, the experiment still echoing in their bones. Because the body remembers what the world prefers to forget. The doctors defended themselves with familiar words: orders, science, necessity. But the logic of obedience had no answer to the logic of suffering. The rabbits had rewritten that logic, not with ink, but with survival. Today, in the museum that Ravensbrück has become, a single glass case holds their photographs. Rows of faces, young, thoughtful, unsmiling. You can almost feel them watching back, as if asking whether the world has learned anything at all. The light in the room falls softly across their eyes, just as it did in the barracks. And for a moment, the difference between past and present collapses. You realize that the experiment never truly ended. It simply changed form, waiting for us to recognize it again. Outside, the lake glimmers, calm and indifferent. A breeze moves through the birch trees, rustling the leaves with a sound like turning pages. It could be mistaken for peace. But beneath it lies the pulse of memory, quiet, steady, unbroken. Because every scar is an unfinished sentence, and every act of remembrance is the body refusing to let that sentence fade. Chapter 4: The Shadow Factories. The Expansion of Silence. By 1944, Ravensbrück had multiplied. What began as a single camp beside a quiet lake became an empire of suffering. The maps show lines spreading outward like veins, over 30 satellite camps across Germany, Poland, Austria, each one a shadow of the original, built to feed the factories of war. The names blur together: Neustadt, Leipzig, Honau, Helmstedt, Rechlin. Some were near towns, others hidden in forests or buried beneath hills. Women were sent there in convoys, packed into trucks or trains without windows. Each journey erased another piece of the self. The new camps were smaller, but no less cruel. They carried Ravensbrück's discipline like a contagion: the same fences, the same whistles, the same arithmetic of exhaustion. The women were no longer numbers in a ledger. They were production units in a crumbling economy. By then, the Reich was dying, though it didn't yet know how to stop. Factories ran day and night to replace what the front consumed. And as men were drafted, the burden fell on the enslaved. Women made bullets for battles they would never see, planes that would bomb cities they once called home. Ravensbrück became the center of coordination, the heart pumping labor into the war's failing limbs. Transports left daily, carrying hundreds of women to subcamps whose locations they never learned. The trains moved mostly at night, their lights covered, their destinations whispered. To the guards, it was logistics. To the women, it was disappearance. Industry of desperation. The tone of the war changed. You could hear it in the orders, see it in the guards' eyes. Certainty was gone, replaced by desperation. Bombs fell closer now, shaking the ground beneath the camp. Each explosion was both terror and hope, destruction that might mean rescue. Factories demanded more labor, more speed. The SS began renting prisoners to companies at higher rates. Every scar became currency, every hour another profit. Hunger deepened, rations thinned, and exhaustion became a form of death that didn't need bullets. At night, women slept sitting up. Their dreams were mechanical, machines that never stopped, assembly lines that ran through the dark. Some woke screaming from nightmares of production quotas. Others didn't wake at all. Letters from home stopped arriving. Rumors replaced them. The front was collapsing. The Allies had landed. Warsaw was in ruins. Paris was free. But here, behind a wire, the seasons only repeated themselves. The guards began to change, too. Some hardened, others faltered. You could see it in the way they smoked. Faster, deeper, the matches trembling slightly in the wind. They had built a world on fear, and now fear was eating them back. Inside the seamen's halls, the women worked through air so thick with dust it turned their hair grey. They assembled parts they no longer recognized, fragments of planes, rockets, bombs. The sound was endless, the vibration constant. To think was to lose rhythm. To stop was to invite death. And yet, something in the rhythm changed. Mistakes appeared more often. Tools broke accidentally. Parts went missing. A quiet sabotage began, invisible, deliberate, and alive. The factories in the forest. Some subcamps were hidden deep in woods where fog clung to the trees like smoke. In places like Neubrandenburg and Molchow, women worked underground, carving out tunnels for armament plants. The air was damp, filled with echoes of dripping water and the hiss of welding torches. There was no daylight, only electric lamps that hummed faintly and left the world the color of metal. The women worked in shifts that blurred into one another, 12 hours, sometimes 16. They built fuselages for aircraft, parts for V2 rockets, electrical wiring for submarines. The precision was absurd, their exhaustion profound. Still, the machine demanded more. Sometimes, during rare breaks, they would steal fragments of paper, blueprints, packing slips, cigarette wrappers, and write names on them. Just names. They hid them inside walls, under floorboards, between bricks. Messages for a future that might someday exist. A Czech prisoner recalled hearing a nightingale sing above the tunnel entrance. She said it sounded like a lie, that something so alive could exist above a place so suffocating. But she listened anyway, storing the sound like medicine. Diseases spread quickly. Typhus, dysentery, frostbite. There were no doctors, only prisoners who pretended to be. They used tools made from spoons, disinfected wounds with ashes. When a woman died, her body was carried out quietly, wrapped in a work jacket. The next day, someone else filled her place. The guards kept lists, the overseers kept schedules, the companies kept profits, and the forest kept secrets. Even now, decades later, those tunnels remain, half collapsed, filled with mud and silence. Roots grow through them like veins reclaiming the body of the earth. The cracks in the machine. By early 1945, the empire of control began to fracture. Trains stopped coming. Supplies ran out. The SS burned documents, moved prisoners, erased traces. But the erasure itself became its own evidence, the panic of a system finally seeing itself. Women sensed the shift before anyone said a word. The guards' posture changed. Orders became confused. Rumors multiplied like flies. The Russians were near, the Americans closer, Berlin falling. Some guards fled. Others grew more violent. Every day felt like the edge of something vast and unknowable. In the sub-camps, production slowed. Machines broke and were not repaired. The factory floors filled with dust. The air carried a strange new sound, silence, returning for the first time in years. One morning in April, a woman in the Neubrandenburg sub-camp found a bird's feather caught in the wire fence. She tucked it into her sleeve, unsure why. Later, when the guards fled and the camp was abandoned, she carried it with her as she walked toward the forest. Years later, she said that the feather felt warm in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her. Back in Ravensbrück, the main camp still operated, though chaos had replaced order. Transports of women from other camps arrived daily, skeletal, hollow, half dead. The crematorium smoked without pause. The commandant gave his last orders with the precision of a man pretending not to see the end. When the gates finally opened in late April 1945, the first soldiers to enter found a landscape of ghosts. Women too weak to stand, lying in rows. Papers burned, uniforms discarded, dogs wandering the yard. And beyond the fences, the lake, calm, glimmering, impossibly still. The factories stopped. The blueprints vanished. The machine of obedience had finally broken itself. But even among the ruins, the women remembered. They had written their names in hidden places, carved initials into the walls, passed down songs in whispers. And those small, invisible acts outlived the empire that tried to erase them. In the years that followed, archaeologists would find those scraps of paper, those scratched initials, those faint carvings. Names. Dates. A word like hope in Polish, written in pencil that never quite faded. Each one was a map back to humanity, drawn by hands that refused to vanish. Chapter 5. The Camp Within the Camp. Hierarchies of Survival. Ravensbrück was not only a camp, it was a pyramid, built from fear, layered by power, held together by silence. Every layer fed the one above it. Every order traveled downward until it reached those with nothing left to command but themselves. At the top were the SS women, hundreds of them. young, well-fed, trained in obedience and detachment. They wore pressed uniforms, boots that shone even in mud. Some came from farms or small towns, others from cities where war had blurred ambition with ideology. They were told they were serving their nation, but what they really served was a system that rewarded indifference. Below them were the Oberoffizierinnen, senior wardresses like Johanna Langfeld, Dorothea Binz, and later Greta Bosel. They managed the camp with military precision, keeping records of punishment, labor, and death. Their offices smelled of paper and perfume. Their language was clipped, administrative, devoid of feeling. They called the prisoners material. Material breaks. Material can be replaced. Then came the Blockhaltist, prisoner block leaders. Selected from among the inmates, they were given small privileges in exchange for maintaining order. A little more food, a softer bed, a slower death. Some became brutal. Others tried to soften the blows. Power, even a fragment of it, was corrosive. It ate at empathy the way rust eats at iron. And beneath them all, the majority, the nameless thousands. Those who obeyed, endured, survived. The hierarchy was meant to divide, to turn despair into competition, because a divided camp was easier to control than a united one. The result was a world where cruelty flowed downward and guilt pooled everywhere. And in that hierarchy, every woman faced a choice, sometimes conscious, sometimes not, between surviving and remaining human. The mirror of power. The guards of Ravensbrück were not demons carved from myth. They were human, and that was the horror. Many were in their 20s, some barely older than the prisoners they commanded. They received training in obedience, not ideology, how to march, how to shout, how to look without seeing. They were told that sentimentality was weakness, that order was virtue, and slowly they learned to believe it. They called their work service. But service to what? A flag? A cause? A fear of consequence? Obedience, once learned, becomes its own language, and soon they spoke it fluently. Some guards enjoyed their power openly. Dorothea Binz was known for her precision, her posture straight, her voice like a blade. She believed discipline was beauty. She punished infractions not with rage, but with ritual. In her world, cruelty was simply a form of order. Others struggled. There are testimonies of SS women who looked away during executions, who smuggled scraps of bread to prisoners, who broke under guilt and drank themselves numb. One wrote in her diary that she dreamed of the women she had struck, dreamed they stood around her bed and stared silently until morning. Even she didn't know if it was remorse or fear. Power turns reflection into danger. To question is to risk collapse. So most guards stopped looking in mirrors, and most prisoners learned not to meet their eyes. But sometimes, just sometimes, the line blurred. A look held too long, a shared cigarette, a moment of understanding that neither could admit to, because in a place built on hierarchy, empathy was treason. The quiet rebels. Not all who held authority became monsters. Some used their fragile positions as shields, thin, trembling walls against the system's worst demands. A Czech nurse assigned to the infirmary falsified death reports to protect patients from execution lists. A Polish blockhaltist pretended not to see women hiding scraps of bread. A French translator misinterpreted orders on purpose, delaying punishments by hours, sometimes days. None of it changed the machinery of the camp. But within that machinery, it created small spaces where humanity could still breathe. And sometimes that was enough. In Block 32, where the sick were kept, the prisoners built their own code. Never steal from the dying. Always share medicine, even when it's water. Speak softly so fear cannot hear you. They whispered stories at night, not of hope, but of dignity, because hope was too fragile to touch, but dignity could still be spoken. There were coppos who refused to strike, guards who passed notes, a German seamstress who stitched pockets into uniforms to hide bread for others, a woman who sang softly in her sleep, and somehow that sound made the darkness less complete. None of them were heroes in the way stories prefer. They were simply human beings who, for 1 second longer than expected, refused to be otherwise. And yet, for every act of kindness, there was betrayal. The same hand that offered bread might later point to a name. The same woman who comforted a sick prisoner might, under threat, condemn her to the punishment block. Ravensbrück turned morality into a maze without exits. You could survive it, but you could not leave it clean. The cost of survival. When liberation came, the hierarchy collapsed overnight, but its shadows remained. The SS fled. The coppos stripped off their armbands. The guards who survived tried to blend into the crowd. And the prisoners, once divided by color, number, and privilege, stood together again, equal in exhaustion. But freedom brought new questions. Who had helped? Who had harmed? Who had done both? In post-war testimonies, these questions hung heavy, unanswered. Some women spoke of compassion under impossible conditions. Others spoke of betrayal they could not forgive. And some said nothing at all, because silence was easier than judgment. At the Nuremberg trials, the SS women were called to account. Binz was executed. Bosel too. Others served brief sentences and vanished into ordinary lives. Some remarried, had children, worked in offices or shops. They learned to call what they did duty. They looked in mirrors again. The survivors carried their own mirrors, invisible, heavy. Many couldn't look at themselves without remembering what they had done to live. A stolen crust, a word unsaid, a moment of compliance. Survival itself had become morally complicated. One survivor, a Norwegian prisoner, later wrote, "There were many Ravensbrücks, one for each woman. And the hardest one to leave was the one inside ourselves." Years after the war, during a reunion of survivors, a woman asked if anyone remembered the block leader who once smuggled medicine. No one did. But someone recalled her hands, small, shaking, always washing. And that image stayed, a woman washing her hands in a tin basin, water grey with soap and ash. Not out of guilt, not entirely, but because, in a place built on filth, cleanliness had been the only prayer left. Outside, the lake still shimmered. The trees grew taller, and the wind that once carried orders now carried only leaves. But inside every survivor, a smaller Ravensbrück remained, the camp within the camp, built not of wire but of memory. Chapter 6. The Letters That Never Came. Paper and silence. In Ravensbrück, words were contraband. Not all of them, only the kind that connected one soul to another. The SS allowed letters, at first. 1 page, written in German, no more than 15 lines. Only to family, only about health, only about obedience. Every sentence inspected, every comma suspect. The letters passed through hands that wore gloves, scissors, authority. By the time they reached the outside world, they were skeletons, stripped of truth, dressed in politeness. Still, the women wrote them, because to write was to remember that language once belonged to them. Each woman was allowed to send 2 letters a month, if she behaved. Ink was rationed. Paper was precious. Sometimes they wrote with slivers of pencil, sometimes with charcoal, sometimes with a sharpened nail dipped in soot and spit. The lines trembled not from cold, but from the weight of what could not be said. I am healthy. I am working. We receive soup every day. These were the permitted phrases, the grammar of captivity. They said nothing, but meant everything. Somewhere beyond the fence, families waited for those words, not for their truth, but for their existence. Because a letter, however false, meant a heartbeat still present in the world. The women queued outside the block to deliver their envelopes, holding them like offerings. A guard would collect them, sort them, discard those written in forbidden tongues, Polish, French, Czech. The rest vanished into a bureaucratic abyss. Weeks passed. Months. Sometimes a letter would return, unopened, stamped Zurich, Empfänger unbekannt. Return to sender, recipient unknown. And that was how many learned that their homes no longer existed. Even silence had a return address. The hand that writes. There were women who wrote even when letters were banned. They wrote on scraps of fabric, on birch bark, on the inside of paper sacks stolen from the kitchens. They hid them in mattresses, under floorboards, inside the hems of dresses. They wrote not to send, but to survive. The act itself became sacred. The feel of graphite against paper, the curve of a familiar name, the illusion of conversation. Every word a pulse, every sentence a breath. A Polish prisoner wrote to her mother, I know this will never reach you, but I need to speak to someone who remembers me before the wire. Another addressed her child, You are 3 now. Do you still like apples? I dream of your voice, though I have begun to forget its sound. Others wrote lists, names, recipes, verses of poems. Fragments of identity anchored against oblivion. One wrote out the multiplication tables she had once taught her students, just to prove her mind still worked. At night, when the barracks grew quiet, the women would whisper their letters aloud. The darkness listened. Some repeated the same lines over and over, like prayers. I am here. Do not forget me. I will come home. The next morning, the paper would be hidden, burned, or passed secretly to another woman whose family lived in the same town, a thread stretched across fences, carrying memory further than hope ever could. The ones who waited. Far from the camp, the war had its own rhythm, and the silence of Ravensbrück echoed in kitchens, on doorsteps, in post offices that no longer knew what to say. A mother in Krakow walked to the post box every morning for 2 years. Each time she found it empty, she told herself perhaps the next day. When the letter finally came, it was a single sheet, printed, impersonal, bearing the stamp of the Reich. Her daughter was, well, her work, useful. No signature, no smell of ink, only the cold geometry of survival. In Oslo, a husband opened a letter addressed in familiar handwriting, but the words felt foreign. Everything is fine, it said. He read it aloud to their child, though his voice broke halfway through. He knew his wife never wrote like that. The phrasing belonged to someone else. Still, he folded it carefully and kept it in a box by the window, a relic of presence. In Paris, a sister never received anything at all. She wrote every month anyway, knowing her letters would vanish into the same silence that swallowed her dreams. On the envelopes, she wrote the same line each time, For my sister, wherever she may be. When the war ended, the box of unsent letters was found in a train station in Berlin, thousands of envelopes addressed to ghosts. Some still bore traces of perfume, others tiny fingerprints, smudges of ink, teardrops turned brown with time. Those who waited learned that absence could also write. It wrote across the face, in the way eyes searched empty air. It wrote across years, in the way silence began to sound like breathing. Echoes on paper. After liberation, the survivors searched for letters, not to send, but to prove they had once existed. They sifted through piles of ash, boxes of records, fragments of diaries. Sometimes they found a page with a name, sometimes a single line. Each discovery was a resurrection. Museums would later display them behind glass. Faded ink, trembling cursive, phrases too ordinary to be imagined. "My dear Mama, I am well. Please tell the children I think of them. We will see each other soon." Simple sentences that carried whole universes. Historians call them artifacts. But for those who read them, they are voices, still speaking, still waiting for replies that will never come. In the Ravensbrück archive, one letter remains unopened. It was written by a woman named Irina, addressed to her son in Lodz. The envelope was never sealed, never stamped. Inside, the last line reads, "When the wind moves across the lake, think of me." You can almost hear the pen lift from the paper, mid-thought, mid-breath. A silence that completes the sentence. Today, the lake beside the camp looks peaceful. Swans drift across it, their reflections unbroken. Visitors walk quietly along the path where the mail truck once passed. And if you stand there long enough, the wind will touch your face. Soft, persistent, familiar. It carries no words, but it feels like one. You imagine a single letter, folded and yellowed, carried by the wind across the water. The ink fading, the paper dissolving, until nothing remains but the memory of a hand that once wrote, and the echo of a voice that refused to vanish. Because sometimes the letters that never came are the ones that still speak most clearly. Chapter 7. The March of the Dying. The order to move. It began with shouting, not the familiar rhythm of roll call, not the daily orders, something different. Urgent, disordered, the kind of shouting that meant fear had entered even the mouths of the guards. April 1945. The front was collapsing. The Red Army was less than 60 kilometers away. From the north came the dull thunder of artillery, a sound the camp had never heard so close. For the first time, the walls of Ravensbrück trembled from something other than its own machinery. The command came swiftly, Evakuierung, evacuation. But there was no plan, only panic disguised as discipline. The SS wanted the evidence gone, the prisoners dispersed, the witnesses silenced. Trucks were scarce, trains destroyed, roads broken by bomb craters. So they did what armies do when they run out of order. They made people walk. The women were assembled in columns, thousands of them. Those who could stand supported those who could not. Those who could not were left behind. No one asked where they were going. The guards didn't know either. The only direction was away, always away. The gates opened one last time. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, the same water that had mirrored the beginning now reflecting the end. The women stepped through the arch where their names had once been replaced by numbers. They had entered Ravensbrück as prisoners. They left it as ghosts still moving. The road without end. The march began before dawn. Frost lay on the fields, turning the world pale blue. The sound of boots and clogs on frozen mud became the only language left, a slow, uneven rhythm of survival. They walked in rows of 5, guarded by SS men and women with rifles, dogs straining on leashes. Some wore coats made from stolen fabric, others only rags. The cold burned like fire. Hunger moved through the ranks like a second shadow. Villagers watched from windows as the columns passed. Some pretended not to see. A few slipped bread or potatoes onto the road when the guards weren't looking. Most simply stared, the way one looks at a storm one cannot stop. The road was littered with the things people discard when they run out of strength. A shoe, a spoon, a piece of cloth that once was a scarf. Each object a sentence cut short. At night, they slept in barns, fields, ditches. Those who fell behind were shot. The dogs learned to recognize the sound of collapse. The sky remained gray for days. There were no songs anymore, only breath. Some tried to count the steps, 10,020, as if mathematics could order the chaos. Others simply moved one foot after another, because motion was all that stood between them and death. The SS guards changed shifts, but the prisoners did not. For them, time had lost its shape. Each day was the same horizon, the same road, the same sound of feet on earth. They no longer dreamed of liberation. They dreamed of stopping. The sound of footsteps. Somewhere along the road, near a village whose name no one remembered, a woman stumbled. Her friend caught her by the arm. Together they fell, rose, fell again. A guard raised his rifle but didn't fire, maybe out of exhaustion, maybe out of something else. The women kept walking. They shared water, crusts, fragments of words. Sometimes they hummed melodies from before the war, lullabies, hymns, folk songs. The sound was so faint it could have been the wind. One night, as they rested in a field, someone began to speak aloud. A Polish poem whispered into the dark. Others joined, line by line, in broken accents. The guards shouted for silence, but the words kept flowing, too soft to stop. The poem was about spring. No one remembered the ending, so they made one up. The march was no longer about reaching anywhere. It was about not disappearing before they did. The road became a kind of prayer, each step a syllable, each breath an act of resistance. When one woman died, the others covered her face with her shawl and kept walking. There was no time for graves, no space for ceremony. But the gesture mattered. It was the last remnant of the world before this one. A Czech survivor later said, "We walked out of the world and into silence, but the silence was ours, not theirs." The last journey. By the end of April, the columns began to thin. Some guards deserted. Others threw down their weapons and fled into the woods. The order that had built the camp was dissolving faster than ice in the sun. The women walked until the road itself seemed to blur. Villagers whispered that the war was over, that Hitler was dead, that the Russians were near. The women didn't believe it. They had learned not to trust words. Only what they could touch, what they could breathe, what they could endure. One morning they saw trucks approaching, white with red crosses painted on the sides. The guards hesitated, then vanished into the trees. The women stood still, afraid to move. The trucks stopped. Voices called out, not in German, but in Swedish. The white buses. It took a moment for understanding to reach them. Freedom is not loud. It arrives like a whisper that takes time to believe. Some fell to their knees. Some kept standing, unable to move. Some wept without sound. A few smiled, small, uncertain smiles that trembled on their faces like new light. The rescuers lifted them gently into the trucks. Hands that had known only commands now offered help. Blankets, milk, water. The taste of kindness was almost unbearable. As the buses drove away, the road stretched behind them, endless, grey, empty. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint echo of footsteps that would never end. One woman turned in her seat and looked back through the window. The road glimmered under the pale sky, vanishing into mist. She touched the glass as if to hold it still, the memory, the silence, the ones who hadn't made it this far. And for the first time in years, she stopped walking. The war was over. But the march, the long, invisible one inside the heart, would take a lifetime to end. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Liberation in Fragments. Freedom did not arrive with trumpets. It came in fragments, a footstep, a voice, a door left open. When the Red Army reached Ravensbrück in late April 1945, the camp was already half empty. Tens of thousands had been marched away. Those who remained were too weak to move. They lay in the barracks like shadows, wrapped in blankets that smelled of smoke and disinfectant. The walls sweated moisture. The air was thick with fever. The soldiers entered quietly. They had seen death before, but not like this, not so organized, not so domestic. One bent to help a woman stand, only to realize she was too light to lift without breaking. Another lit a cigarette, then lowered it, ashamed to smoke in a place where air itself felt borrowed. The survivors watched them without expression. They didn't cheer. They didn't cry. After so much silence, even freedom sounded like noise. A few days later, Swedish Red Cross trucks arrived, white buses carrying nurses in pale uniforms. They moved carefully through the yard, speaking softly, offering milk, water, words that made no sense yet. The women didn't know whether to trust them. Every uniform had once meant danger, but then someone smiled, and that, finally, was understood. The dead were buried in rows outside the camp walls. Crosses made of twigs. Names written in charcoal. The living were counted again, but this time the numbers meant survival. And as spring crept into the air, a new sound joined the wind. Paper rustling. Lists. Records. Testimonies. The beginning of memory turning itself into evidence. The evidence of silence. When the journalists arrived, they brought cameras, notebooks, disbelief. They photographed the barracks, the ovens, the piles of shoes, the scattered letters that had never been sent. They wrote headlines that tried to explain the unexplainable. They used words like horror and atrocity, though none of them seemed large enough. 4 weeks, investigators collected documents, transport lists, guard rosters, medical logs, orders signed in elegant handwriting. Each sheet of paper was both proof and denial. The bureaucracy of murder, written in perfect penmanship. The camp itself became an archive. Rooms that once held women now held boxes. The roll call square was measured and photographed, as if geometry could reveal truth. The lake was dredged, searching for ashes that refused to dissolve. Survivors gave statements, in Polish, French, Russian, German. Some spoke clearly, others trembled. Some stared into space, sentences half-formed, trailing off into silence. A translator wrote in the margin, "Weeping cannot continue." The world outside wanted to understand. But understanding was not what Ravensbrück offered. It offered witnessing. And witnessing is not comprehension. It is a kind of quiet blindness that still refuses to look away. The first visitors described the silence most of all. No birds. No laughter. Only the sound of the wind moving through the wire, a voice that did not stop, even after everyone else had. The women on trial. In 1946, a courtroom in Hamburg filled with echoes. It smelled of dust, sweat, and old paper. On one side, the defendants, 21 women and 7 men, former SS personnel of Ravensbrück. On the other, The survivors, thinner now, older, but unbroken. Between them, the law, trying to measure what could not be measured. The guards arrived in plain clothes, some defiant, some hollow. Dorothea Binns sat upright, hands folded neatly. Greta Bosel avoided the cameras. Others wept, insisted they were following orders, that they were secretaries, that they never touched a whip. Their words were polished, their voices controlled. They had learned the language of survival, too. Then the witnesses spoke. One by one they stood and told their stories, not with rage, but with precision. They named names, described faces, recounted punishments, experiments, disappearances. Their voices filled the room slowly, like water seeping into cracks. The defendants looked down, or stared straight ahead. The air thickened with things that could not be unseen. A Polish survivor lifted her skirt to show her scars, clean, white, shining under the courtroom light. The room fell silent. Even the judges did not speak. The transcripts recorded everything. Subject operated on without anesthesia. Orders signed by Commandant Surin. Prisoner beaten for singing. At the end of the first trial, 11 were sentenced to death. Others received prison terms. Some were acquitted for lack of evidence. Justice, like everything else here, was uneven, but for the survivors, the verdict was never the point. The trial itself was the victory, the moment their voices became louder than silence. The weight of justice. The world moved on quickly. New wars, new borders, new fears. Ravensbrück became a line in a history book, then a museum, then a place for school trips and commemorations. But for those who had lived it, the reckoning never ended. Some survivors testified again, at later trials in the 1950s. Each time they repeated their stories, they lost a little more of themselves. Memory, when spoken too often, begins to hollow out the speaker. Yet they kept speaking, for those who could not. Others stayed silent for decades, choosing ordinary lives. They married, worked, raised children, baked bread, paid bills. But sometimes a sound, the slam of a door, the bark of a dog, the smell of smoke, would pull them back to the yard, the roll call, the wire. Reckoning is not only about guilt. It is about gravity, what the past does to those who survived it. In Hamburg, the courthouse still stands. Visitors walk its corridors, reading plaques, unaware of the weight of breath once held there. In archives, the testimonies rest in folders, thousands of pages of voices turned into paper. Every so often, a historian opens one. The room fills again with those same words: cold, hunger, waiting. Justice did not heal. It did not erase. It simply wrote the story down. And writing, as the women of Ravensbrück had already learned, is another form of survival. One transcript ends with a line almost too simple to notice. A witness, asked if she has anything more to add, replies, "Only that we were there." She pauses, "and that we are still here." The courtroom light falls across her face, white, steady, unflinching. Her voice leaves her mouth, crosses the years, and settles softly in the air around us, where it still waits to be heard. And for a moment, the reckoning feels less like judgment, and more like remembrance finally breathing. Chapter 9. The Women Who Remembered. The Return to the World. They came back one by one, not as heroes, not even as victims, just as women who had survived what had no name yet. The buses brought them to stations that smelled of coal and rain. They stepped onto platforms where no one was waiting. The world had moved on, new governments, new currencies, new ruins. Even the air felt foreign. Some went home to find strangers living in their houses. Others found their families gone, their towns destroyed, their names forgotten from the registry. They knocked on doors and were met with disbelief. "You? We thought you were dead." They nodded. In some ways, they were. Hospitals filled with the newly freed, skeletal bodies, infections, hollow eyes that refused to close. Doctors spoke of rehabilitation, but what does that mean when the wound is memory itself? Those who could returned to work. Teachers taught again. Nurses tended the sick. Mothers tried to remember how to hold their children without shaking. But at night, they still lined up in their dreams, still heard the whistle, still woke to count themselves. The war had ended, but the roll call continued, inside. The long silence. The world wanted stories of victory, not of survival. Men returned from the front with medals. Women returned from the camps with scars. And for a long time, no one wanted to hear them speak. In Poland, France, Norway, the Netherlands, each country built its own narrative of resistance. The camps did not fit neatly inside it. They were too raw, too complicated, too full of shame. Some survivors stayed silent because the words hurt too much. Others because they feared being doubted. What was it really like? People asked, as if horror needed proof. They met instead in kitchens, church halls, small apartments, gatherings without fanfare, where one could say Ravensbrück and be understood. They shared tea, bread, photographs. They showed each other the faded numbers tattooed on their arms, or the scars that ran deeper, invisible. Together, they rebuilt what the camp had tried to erase. Community. Letters traveled between them for decades. Old paper, shaky handwriting, greetings that began, "My dear sister from Ravensbrück." The phrase meant something no language could translate. It meant, you were there too. You still exist. So do I. And slowly, the silence began to crack. The guardians of memory. The 1970s brought the return of voices. The generation that had once whispered now spoke aloud, in classrooms, on television, in courtrooms, at memorials. Books appeared, memoirs, diaries, collections of letters rescued from drawers. Names long buried in archives resurfaced. The rabbits, the Polish women of the medical experiments, formed an association. They traveled to Paris, London, Warsaw, Stockholm, telling their stories not as wounds but as warnings. In Germany, students began visiting the sites of former camps. They planted flowers. They listened. They asked questions their parents couldn't answer. The Ravensbrück Memorial was opened in 1959, but for many, it became sacred only when survivors themselves began guiding visitors there. They walked through the ruins, pointing out where the roll call square had been, where the barracks once stood. They described the smell of the kitchen, the sound of the lake in winter. They carried memory the way one carries a fragile flame, cupped carefully between shaking hands. Art followed. Sculptors carved women not in triumph, but in endurance, bodies upright, faces calm, hands open. Composers wrote requiems that ended not in crescendo, but in silence. Writers found words that refused to settle, like smoke trapped under glass. In schools, children learned to spell the name, Ravensbrück. They repeated it aloud, unsure of its weight, but still speaking it. And in that repetition, the world began to change. The circle of names. Today, the camp is quiet again. Grass grows where gravel once burned under boots. The lake mirrors the sky with a stillness that feels deliberate, as if guarding what lies beneath. The barracks are gone, but the air remembers. Every April, survivors and their descendants return. They come from Poland, France, Germany, Denmark, Israel, carrying flowers, candles, photographs. They stand in a circle by the water, their reflections trembling in the breeze. A priest reads a prayer. A child reads a list of names. Some of those names were once erased. Now they are spoken again. In one corner of the memorial stands a sculpture. 3 women standing together, heads slightly bowed. They are not saints or martyrs. They are witnesses, ordinary, eternal. When the wind moves through the trees, it sounds like whispers weaving through their bronze hair. Nearby, an old woman lays a single rose at the base of the monument. Her hands tremble, but her gaze is steady. She is one of the last survivors. She closes her eyes and says quietly, "We are still here." Behind her, the younger generations listen. They record videos, take notes, promise to remember. But remembrance is not a promise. It is a practice. It requires repetition, care, and silence. The kind of silence that does not erase, but preserves. As dusk settles, candles flicker along the lake's edge. The water carries their reflections outward, small flames drifting on a surface older than grief. Wind stirs them gently, never enough to extinguish, only to remind that memory moves. Somewhere, a bell rings. The night air smells of pine and smoke and the faint sweetness of spring. The last light fades from the sky, and with it, the boundaries between past and present blur once more. And in that merging, you can almost hear the voices again. Soft, layered, eternal. The women who remembered, and the world that, finally, began to listen. Epilogue: The lake that remembers. Morning again, but not the kind the camp once knew. This one rises gently. No whistles, no orders, only the slow unfolding of light over water. You stand where the fence once cut the horizon. It's gone now, the posts removed, the wire rusted away. Grass grows in its place, soft and forgiving. But if you look closely, you can still see the line it left behind, faint as a scar. The lake lies still beside you, grey-blue and endless. Mist hovers over its surface, curling like breath in cold air. Swans drift across it, silent, weightless, the same birds that once watched women march along the shore. Every ripple feels deliberate, like the water itself remembers. There is no sound except wind in the birch trees. It whispers through the leaves, carrying voices that don't need words anymore. You can almost hear them, not crying, not pleading, just existing. Steady, present, eternal. The memorial grounds are empty this morning. A candle from last night still burns near the stone wall. Someone has left a photograph tucked beneath it, a woman in uniform, smiling faintly, hair pulled back. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, 3 words: "For my sister." You walk slowly along the path. It crunches beneath your feet. Gravel, not ash now. The air smells of pine and rain. The sky opens in pale gold, the color of forgiveness. It's hard to imagine that this place once hummed with command, that the walls once echoed with roll calls, boots, dogs, the sound of names being turned into numbers. Now there is only quiet, the kind that holds rather than hides. Each year, visitors come here to look, to learn, to stand in silence. Some cry. Some cannot. Some leave flowers. Others leave nothing but the warmth of their breath. And all of them, whether they realize it or not, add another layer of remembering to the air. Because memory is not just what is told. It's what lingers. It's the shape of silence after the last word has been spoken. It's the way light bends differently over places that have known sorrow. You stop by the water's edge. The wind moves again, and the lake stirs. Tiny waves tap against the stones like fingers on a door. It feels less like mourning and more like conversation, as if history itself was still trying to answer. Somewhere nearby, a bell rings, faint, far away. Maybe from the town, maybe from memory. It fades into the air, and the air keeps it. You think of the women who once stood here, the ones who worked, who resisted, who sang, who wrote letters they could never send. You think of the ones who didn't return, and the ones who carried their stories for decades afterward. You think of how endurance, repeated enough times, becomes something like grace. A swan lifts from the water, its wings slow and deliberate. It circles once, twice, then disappears into the clouds. The sound of its flight lingers, soft, rhythmic, impossibly calm. If you listen closely, it sounds like footsteps fading down a road that no longer hurts to remember. Aftermath, the silence that remains. Spring comes late to Ravensbrück. The frost melts reluctantly, as if unsure whether the ground deserves warmth again. The lake no longer hides beneath ice, and yet the water still moves with the slowness of grief. The trees have grown tall where the fences once stood. Their branches touch where the wires used to cut. And if you listen closely, when the wind moves through them, you can almost hear the faint hum of memory, a sound that is neither song nor sorrow, but something in between. The camp is quiet now. Tourists walk its paths with maps folded in their hands, their footsteps soft on the gravel. A bird lands on a rusted gatepost, tilts its head, then flies on. The air smells of pine and distant rain. No shouting, no sirens, no dogs, only the gentle murmur of a world that has learned how to keep its voice low out of respect. You walk slowly. Beneath your feet, the earth is uneven. Small rises where barracks once stood, where bunks pressed into the soil through years of wait and waiting. Here, history is not told in words, but in absences. Every empty space means someone once stood there. Every silence means someone once spoke. You pause by the lake. It looks ordinary now, like any northern lake. Grey, reflective, calm. But you know its story. You know that beneath the surface lies the dust of the uncounted. Ash scattered in water because it was the only grave allowed. And yet, somehow, the lake endures, not as a wound, but as witness. It holds its reflection carefully, as if afraid to drop it. They came here from everywhere. Poland, France, Norway, the Netherlands. Doctors, students, mothers, daughters. Some carried messages sewn into hems, others carried only the memory of names. When the gates closed behind them, they were told they were nothing. But that was the camp's first lie, and they refused to believe it. In secret, they wrote poems on scraps of paper, traced prayers on walls with their fingertips. They tore thread from uniforms to mend each other's wounds. They stole moments of beauty where none were meant to exist, a smile shared in passing, a song whispered when the guards turned away. They kept life alive by remembering it. And when liberation finally came, when the gates swung open to a silence heavier than any storm, many were too weak to walk out. Some crawled to the road. Some waited for names that would never be called. Some simply looked at the sky, wide and empty, and wept not from joy, but from disbelief that it could still be blue. You can almost see them now, moving through the mist, not as ghosts, but as memory rendered visible. They are still teaching us, even in silence, that strength can look like stillness, that resistance can sound like a breath held steady, that survival is its own form of protest. Time has softened the edges here, but not the truth. The buildings crumble, but the air still carries what was once unspeakable. And in that air, in that quiet, you feel the weight of their endurance, not tragic, but absolute. The kind of courage that leaves no statues, only echoes. You touch the stone of the memorial, cold, rough, unadorned. The inscription is simple. It doesn't ask for pity. It asks for remembrance. Because remembrance is what transforms pain into meaning. It is how we keep their names from disappearing into the dust. It is how we say, "You were here. You mattered. You still do." You look once more at the water. The surface trembles, then stills again. A ripple spreads outward, gentle and endless, like a heartbeat that refuses to fade. Maybe that is what memory truly is, not a monument, but movement, not silence, but the sound of the world trying, again and again, to understand. And so, you stand there a little longer. The sky is pale now, streaked with the promise of rain. Somewhere far away, a train passes, slow, distant, almost kind. Life continues. It has to. That, too, is part of the remembering. Before you leave, you look back one last time. The candle still burns. The lake glows faintly in the morning light. And the air, that same air that once carried orders, screams, prayers, now carries only one thing: peace. You breathe it in. Let it fill the spaces where history once felt too heavy to hold. And as you exhale, you understand. Remembrance isn't a burden. It's a bridge between what was and what must never be again. The wind moves once more, gentle, familiar. It sounds like a voice, though no one is speaking. A whisper, timeless and clear. We were here. We are still here. And for a moment, the whole world listens. You're listening to echoes of war.